Hi, everybody. Welcome. It is my honor and my joy, with lots of love, to introduce my daughter, Deb Stuhler-Gross.
Thank you, Big Sal. I let the secret away a little while ago. So I'm Deb. My mom's Sally Davis, if you don't know her. Now, about 40 years ago or so, when she worked at Dixmont State Hospital, her nickname was Big Sal. And so now, from now on, when you see her down here in the pub, let's say, or hanging around, you can say, "Hey, Big Sal." So I'm going to use the microphone because my voice isn't great and your hearing might not be either, I'm told. So I'm here to talk about Croatia and my trip there, and to answer questions and share a bit of the experience that my husband and I had there and some of the people we met, but also to answer questions or learn from you. So as we go, in the next 4 or 5 hours, Dawn, you said you'll be falling asleep, right? Yeah. No, that's an easy joke. I shouldn't do that one. But no. So as I'm talking, though, if somebody has something to share, like, wave at me, because it's an opportunity for all of us to learn something new, and I'll bet you guys have a lot of stories that are just as good as mine. So I brought the topic and the pictures, but whatever we share here, I'm hoping it won't all come from me. Croatia is a country I'll talk more about. It does have the nickname Pearl of the Adriatic. So I put that in the title because when I was emailing with Karen, I needed a title. And Croatia kind of didn't sound all that interesting. This is probably the first and last part that I'll talk about Pearl of the Adriatic, because it is, but that's not really what I'm talking about tonight. So what I will be talking about first, some of you may or may not know where Croatia is, so I'll talk a bit about where it is and why that's important. And then I definitely want to talk about the visit that I had there and why my husband and I went. I'm not going to do a history lesson, okay? Mr. Wright. Charlie, I think you guys know him, but I would have gotten in trouble in 8th grade if I would have said Charlie. So Mr. Wright, he was my math teacher. I liked math better than history, but I've come to like history as well. But I give him full credit because I was a girl in the 70s who liked math. And Mr. Wright made sure to put me up at the chalkboard to answer hard questions, which, as a teenager in the 70s and a girl, was actually kind of scary, but I remember it very well. So I love math, but I've come to like history as well. But Mr. Wright, thank you. Yes?
He told me that you were a star and that you would help all the other girls too, because you were so far ahead and he didn't teach you anything. He said,
Well, so now we have to find out how well we all know each other and how much you have a sense of my sense of humor. It comes from my mother. Because I'm going to say that if Mr. Wright told you that I was a star, his memory might not be as good as you all think it is. So last time I was here, I talked about Poland because that's where I visited in the fall. And I didn't know that my 8th grade and 9th grade math teacher was here until after the talk, and then we had a wonderful chance to catch up. But sincerely, very sincerely, the trajectory of my life in terms of being a girl, not that nerdy, I played sports and stuff, but who liked math, the fact that you encouraged me was awesome. Absolutely awesome. Actually, just, yeah, I mean, really. So, now, Croatia. A bit of history, that's what got me off on that. And then I do want to talk about 3 places, Istria, Rijeka, and Trieste, because they were very meaningful in our travels, and they have some very interesting histories, each of them does. So, first of all, Croatia. let me be kind of the teacher sort of person here and say, by show of hands, how many of you had any idea where Croatia was before you walked in? Okay, good. So of the half of you who didn't raise your hands, I hope you can hear me because I'm going to talk about where Croatia is. So it is in what's called Central Europe. It's kind of near Eastern European countries that were part of the USSR, the Soviet Union, but Croatia wasn't part of the Soviet Union. And if you look at where, I'll talk more about why that's important, but I labeled a couple of the countries here, so everybody kind of probably knows where France is. Italy looks like a boot, that's where Italy is. Germany's up in there, and then I labeled Austria and Hungary because they're going to come back to being important because 150 years ago, they ruled a lot of Europe. Austria and Hungary did, and Croatia was part of that. And then I did label Ukraine because of what's going on now in Ukraine. And so if you see, it's fairly far from Croatia. And some people have asked me, when you were in Europe in the spring, did you feel safe? And I said, yes. Why? And they said, well, you know, all the stuff that's going on in Ukraine, did you feel safe? And I understand the question, but Croatia is really far from Ukraine. And we could do a whole wonderful conversation over wine, I hope, or drinks about Ukraine and politics in Europe. But basically, when it comes to what's going on right now in Ukraine, with Russia, the big top right country there, invading Ukraine, it is distant from Hungary and Austria and Croatia and Italy. But also, I didn't draw it on this map, Ukraine is not part of NATO, many or most of you probably know, and there's a very, very important pact between NATO and among the NATO countries, which says if any one of us is invaded, all of us are invaded, and we will come to your rescue. And Ukraine is not part of that, so it's separate. And that line between Ukraine and, say, Poland, in particular, that's really important because Poland is part of NATO. And so these countries that I've labeled here, Poland, Hungary, etc., they're really not very likely to be invaded by Russia. The Ukrainian crisis, the Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian invasion, whatever you want to call it, really has to do with history between Russia and Ukraine. And that's a bit of a digression, but I've been asked the question so many times this summer that I wanted to just answer it for you, which is, yes, I felt safe in Croatia and Italy, and I'm going to Hungary in 2 weeks. I'm going to feel safe there as well when it comes to Hungary. When it comes to Ukraine, I'm sorry. Yes? Georgia is, does anybody know where Georgia is on this map? Because I don't. That's Crimea, I think. One of these? That's Moldova. East? Oh, okay. So we kind of don't know, but we can look it up later. Yeah, I wish I knew. I learned what I'd learned from where I went. So I want to talk a bit about my visit to Croatia, and also why am I talking about Croatia when I spent the last 5 months, most of it in Italy, but I spent about 5 or 6 weeks in Croatia. And when I was talking to my mom and said, I'd love to come, talk to you guys about whatever I could, I said, I really want to talk about Croatia. Like, I'd like to put a talk together to remember and revisit what we did there, because I learned so much, and it was wonderful. And we were in Italy also, and that was great, but a lot of people have been to parts of Italy and had great experiences. And so I could talk about Florence, which I love. I could talk about Venice, which I went to many times, Rome, which we loved as well, other places. But I don't think I'd have as much to share with everybody that's brand new. Whereas Croatia, a lot of you didn't raise your hand when I said, where is it? And probably, actually, let me ask, how many of you have been to Croatia? Okay, so only a few of you have. But most haven't, so I thought, that's why I'll talk about Croatia. So, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but I wanted to show some pictures of my husband, Joe, because he's actually the reason we're doing all of this, and I thought he ought to get a little bit of attention here. Yeah. Oh, okay, so, whoops. So Georgia is not on my map. Okay, so it's further east. Okay, so this is me with Joe. The reason that we went to Europe is because my husband Joe is a music professor, and he's a choir conductor in particular. He's got his doctorate in choral conducting. And he was teaching at Duquesne University, but largely with COVID, a lot of the choir opportunities decreased, and his choir stopped doing choir stuff. And he's really cranky when he's not doing choir stuff. So I said, well, dude, find yourself some choir stuff somewhere on earth and I can go, because my whole work's on the internet, but I don't like cranky you. And so he sent emails to, I think, 40 or 50 different places, truly just looked on the internet, found connections. And last fall, we spent in Poland. And then in the spring, we actually spent, he was assigned to, or he had an agreement with a music conservatory in Trieste, Italy. But he only had to work 1 or 2 days a week. So it was kind of a vacation for the most part. So that's us in Trieste up at the top. This is us in Istria, which is part of Croatia. And that's us also in Trieste, down at the bottom left. And Trieste, I'm going to talk a little bit about Trieste, even though it's in Italy, because I loved it so much. So Trieste. You see Italy's the boot over there. Rome, the capital, is kind of in the middle, north to south. Trieste, you look at, it's way, way up in the corner of Italy. So the green is Italy. Trieste is way up in the northeast corner. And then I labeled Croatia on this map as that boomerang-shaped country. And so Trieste is very, very close to Croatia. In fact, it was about a 15-minute car ride to go from the center of Trieste, the city, into Croatia. So it's really very close. And there are a lot of Croatians in Trieste and a lot of Triestians in Croatia. Trieste, to do a commercial, is like the most magical place. This picture, by the way, all pictures, I told Karen Hammond that all the pictures in this are ones I took, so you don't have to worry about copyrights or anything, but sometimes I look at these and say, you know, that looks like that could have been on the internet. Like, that's pretty nice. And I am not a good photographer. I took it with I took the pictures with my phone. It's just a beautiful city. So this top picture, it might be hard to see, but there's this statue of these women. It's on the Adriatic Sea, so it's on the water. And just at the distance there, you might not be able to see it, but are mountains. So on most days, and on a clear day, but on most days, you look over the water at the mountains. It's just gorgeous. And then this government building in the center would be, if I were to be looking at the mountains and the sea, and then literally turn around and take a picture behind me, that's the building that was behind me. Now, those two pictures obviously are day and night, so not at the same time, but there's a huge square there, and it's from the 1700s, and it just is, you know, European wonderful. And then I have something like 40 different pictures of sunsets on the Adriatic, because being from Pittsburgh, seeing the sun set over water is so different. And it was gorgeous. That one I just liked because that guy playing the guitar, it was just a quiet, magical moment. Plus, that just looks really romantic, so I thought I'd show that one. The other thing, though, about Trieste is they have a love of music. So that's Joe, my husband. I have photographic proof that while we were there, he actually did work. So he taught a number of different classes, and one of the choirs he had was high school students who went to this conservatory for their choir. And they were delightful, and he had a great time. Okay, so now when it comes to Trieste and Croatia, Trieste, the prior slide I showed, it's at the top east of the top right of Italy. So if you look now in red is Trieste, and that's Italy is off to the other side of the map. So the countries that are bordering are Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then those little blue dots are places that my husband and I went while in the last few months. And so what you can see is that we were in Trieste, and we went to a few places in Slovenia, but we went to quite a few places in Croatia. And then I want to mention a few key terms here. Trieste, I've told you, is a beautiful city in Italy. I loved. Schengen, I'm going to come back to. Croatia is the country we were in. And then Istria, I'm going to go to the next slide and show you a zoom in on Istria. So if you look at the top left there, just under Trieste, there's a little peninsula. Looks like an upside-down triangle with a lot of blue dots on it. That's the Istrian Peninsula. And so my next slide is going to be a zoom in on that. So that's that peninsula, and we spent a little over a month there. And have you heard of Tuscany in Italy? Yeah. So Istria is a lot like Tuscany, except maybe 2/3 as expensive. So there are rolling hills and vineyards and a lot of olive farms, olive groves everywhere. Wonderful people. English we got by with, it was okay. And just magical. It's not busy, no big cities, just a wonderful place to be. And I learned a couple weeks ago that Croatia, the country, and Istria is part of it, they are the leading tourist destinations for Europeans. So it's not the leading destination in the world, but if you take the EU countries, the top destination for vacation is Croatia. And I thought that was bizarre because 6 months ago, I couldn't have named one city in Croatia. And I didn't know anybody who'd been there. But now that I've been there, I know why. So that's a bit about where Croatia is. And I did want to mention Istria. I'm going to go back for a moment, though, and talk a little bit about that second term, Schengen. So I'm going to do this very briefly. For those of you who know more about this, understand that I'm going to be truthful but incomplete. Because what I'm going to say is this. In Europe, and there's the EU, and there's Schengen. And the important thing about Schengen is it's not all of Europe, so it's less than the EU. But if you're an American, you can only spend 90 days there without a visa. That was the important part. And my husband had this quote-unquote job in Trieste, Italy, which is part of Schengen. Yeah, well, they're Italian, and oh, wait, how many of you are Italian? Okay, one. I buy you a drink or dinner later. Because I tell you, I really loved the people we met in Italy. I absolutely did. And I made a couple good friends there. I'm still in touch with them. But when it comes to being on top of things or on time, nah, just forget it. So Joe, my husband, had all these arrangements that he and I were making to take our lives and move to Trieste from February until June so that he could be a professor at the Tartini Conservatory of Music. They have a website, they're legitimate, they told him kind of what he was going to do. But the whole thing about getting a visa just didn't seem to ever happen. And this is how we ended up in Croatia. So there is a point to my story, because what we learned was, the visa wasn't going to come, it wasn't going to happen. But they really wanted him to be there for more than 90 days. But you can't be in the Schengen region, that's like most of Europe, as an American for more than 90 days without a visa. So, through a couple different conversations, we came up with this great idea, which is, well, we'll kind of be in Trieste, but when he's not working, we'll go over the border to Croatia because it's not in the Schengen region. And so it didn't count toward our 90 days. And that's what we did. So if we had had a visa for Trieste, I would be doing a talk today about Italy because I would still know nothing about Croatia. But because those Italian folks who were wonderful and nice just never got their act together to get my husband a visa, I now know all kinds of stuff about Croatia, so that's what I'm talking about tonight. The Schengen, by the way, the 90 days, they take, it's not just, well, Europe, they take it very seriously. And so what we learned from a couple people was that if you overstay the 90 days, you don't get kicked out. They're not going to come find you. But when you leave and they stamp your passport, you get thrown onto a list and you are banned from entering the Schengen region for 2 years. So that would have kind of put the kibosh to our idea of returning to Europe this fall, which we are, because my husband has a Fulbright, because we would have been on the we're not allowed in list. So I had a spreadsheet of each day, and we left on day 89 of our 90. I'm not kidding. And I said to Joe, I said, we can't stay any longer because if our flight's delayed by a day or two, we're out of luck. And so we flew back on day 89 of 90. But that left us, we spent 5 weeks in Croatia, which is in the EU, but it's not part of this Schengen deal. Schengen is not on the map. It's actually, it's most of the countries of Europe, okay? So it's not a country. It would be like asking somebody, where's the South of America, like the Confederate States? And we would know how to answer, but it's not like on a map. So Schengen is a little bit like that. So it's most of the countries of the European Union, but not quite all of them. And luckily for us, Croatia is not part of Schengen yet. So, yeah. 26, okay. And I think there might be 30 in the EU. I think there might be 4 or 5 that are not part of Schengen. So the bottom line is, actually the real bottom line is when you're out and about, it's good to just talk to people because the whole idea for us to stay in Croatia so that we could be in Europe for longer than 90 days was because I went on a walking tour of Trieste and I just got to talking to the tour guide, and in the conversation, he said, oh yeah, and I have some friends who live over in Croatia, so they don't have to get a worker's visa to come work in Trieste. Little did I know that 3 weeks later, that would be me, talking to my husband, saying, what are we going to do? And I said, you know, this tour guide said that that's what they did. So the moral of the story is it doesn't hurt to just chat people up. So, a little bit of Croatian history. All right, so I have a couple of slides here with maps, but I'm not going to be a history teacher. I just want to give a couple of a sense of what it's like to be European versus American. So the little blue thing at the top left says 1815. So in 1815, this would have been in America just after the War of 1812, when America was pretty much America. Well, in Europe, it didn't look anything like that map I just showed you. There are no familiar countries here. So there was a thing called Croatia proper, but that was different from Slavonia, that was different from Istria, and that was different from Dalmatia, which came together to form today's Croatia. That was different from Bosnia. So 200 years ago, things were vastly different. And then I'm just going to go to the 20th century because there's a lot of history in between, but we really would be here for 4 hours because Europe is so complicated. But I mentioned earlier Austria and Hungary. So 1914, at the beginning, so in the beginning of World War I, in 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was what's surrounded in the red line there. Okay. So for most of the 1800s, the Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled almost all this region. Okay, so Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, parts of Romania, parts of Poland, and down into what became Yugoslavia and now Croatia. That was all part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I'm going to mention something briefly here, which is that a lot of those groups of people were pulled together under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but didn't like it. So there was almost, I don't think there were any groups of people who viewed themselves as Austrian-Hungarian. They viewed themselves as Austrian or Czech or Serbian or Croatian or whatever. So Europe, that part of Europe is, to me, fascinating because this sense of identity goes back centuries, hundreds of years. And I'm going to guess that for many of you, I know a few of you already have introduced yourselves, but for you, you're American, but your ancestors are from somewhere like this. Nobody's ancestors are from Austria-Hungary. Nobody says that. They might say my ancestor, do you? Oh, okay, go ahead. Aha, that's fantastic. So her grandparents lived in Franz Joseph's Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And if they fought for Franz Joseph, they probably were in the Austrian part of it, but they were Serbs from Croatia. You got the whole, that's the whole map covered. The other part of this is that these boundaries in the 1800s and early part of the 1900s changed a lot because they kept having, I mean, I hate to say it, but there was just war after war after war about the borders. And it's still happening today, Russia invading Ukraine and Russia invading Crimea in 2014. It's still happening. Whereas, and this was my big takeaway from spending some time, not as a tourist in Europe, but somebody meeting people and learning their stories and studying a bit, was I just can't identify that at all. It would be like, I grew up in Ben Avon, and it would be like somebody saying, oh yeah, well my grandparents were there, but that was when it was part of Ohio. Which seems bizarre, but that's the way a lot of this stretch, part of the world is. And so I talked to one guy, we were in Rijeka, and I'll mention, I'm going to tell the story now without pointing to the map, but we were in this city in Croatia. The city's name is Rijeka. And the guy who was the landlord for our apartment told us that his uncle, I believe it was, had a funny story. His uncle would introduce himself to people and say, "Oh yes, I've been in so many places in the world. I've traveled to 6 different countries, and I never left foot across my threshold." Because in his lifetime, Rijeka was conquered 5 different times, conquered or changed with Yugoslavia, but basically, it would be hard. He said, if you want to ask me, who am I, where am I from? He said, it depends. How old do you want to know? When I was 40, I was this. When I was 20, I was this. Now I'm this. And there's also then, and I sense that in Poland as well, a lot of Central and Eastern Europe, this is true. The other thing, though, that's a little sobering for me is what I also came away with was that I think that we are really fortunate to have a sense of a pretty stable permanency. And I'm not going to get into politics about who's right or wrong. What I'm simply going to say is that my takeaway from having lived in America during the last 5 years and the polarization is that that's nothing. that's really, really nothing compared to what so many people there have lived through in their lives or their parents' lives. And I'm not preaching about it. It's just that I find it, I'd never appreciated how stable things are here. We don't live in states or cities that have been invaded. We don't have parents or grandparents who changed flags 6 times in their lifetime. It's just, I grew up here, I had no idea. I just truly had no idea. And when we were there, we talked with some people who said that they don't expect that it'll stay stable there. So in Istria, Istria has changed hands a few times. Let's say it's been part of different countries. And the one woman I talked to, she's lived there, she's in her 30s or early 40s. And she's lived there for 25 or 30 years. And she said that she's of the generation of stability. But she has a daughter who's 5 or 6, and she said, I don't know that my daughter's going to grow up Croatian. She'll stay here, I hope, but who knows what country this is going to be by the time she's in high school or she's getting married or she's having kids. And she said it so very matter-of-factly. And I found that with people who were older, but it was very interesting for me to talk to somebody with a little girl, and for her to just, like I said, be matter-of-fact. So it could be, if I was here and say, yes, I'm in Pennsylvania now, but, well, my daughter, maybe it'll be Ohio again by the time she grows up. It's just unfathomable. And that was true, as I said, through this whole region. So 108 years ago, thank you, Mr. Wright, I did that math really fast. Now I'm asking, did I do it right? 108 years ago, so that is when, I'm guessing none of you were born yet, but many of your parents were alive. Europe looked very different from today. So that big red line, forget all the lines inside. The big red line was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then, if you know anything about World War I, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, which is down near the bottom here, in what's now it was in Bosnia then, but part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, 1914, Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and a whole bunch of these former, not really countries, but regions that had a strong identity declared war on each other, including Germany and Russia, and World War I started, and Europe was at war for 3 long years, horrible years, before America got dragged into it. And at the end of World War I, in 1918 or then 1919, that region was combined, a lot of that, the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, was combined to, and I put this name up here not because of history, but because it tells a lot about that region. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. That was the name of that kingdom for 10 years until 1929. So if I go back, Austro-Hungarian Empire was really big. A bunch of those countries at the end of World War I were put together to the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and 10 years later they renamed it Yugoslavia. And when it comes to Yugoslavia, it survived well beyond 1946, but at the end of World War II, Yugoslavia was turned into a country that was independent. So during World War II, it had been largely independent. Tito was the ruler of Yugoslavia, a fascinating character, by the way. If you ever want to read a good biography, there are 3 or 4 great ones of Tito, and he was amazing. I learned a lot about him, but I won't go into it. But at the end of World War II, Yugoslavia became sort of this buffer between what became USSR and the Western European nations, but it was independent. And Croatia, you see the boomerang, was just a part of that. So that's enough of history. And then in 1992, at the end of when the wall came down and the Soviet Union dissolved, after a few years, each of these countries pretty much gained its independence. And there were a couple wars that were awful, but most of these, Yugoslavia pretty much collapsed with little bloodshed, with a few horrible exceptions. So, now I'd like to tell you a little bit more about 3 of my favorite places and show some pictures and answer questions. So first, Istria. I mentioned earlier, it's that peninsula that's part of Croatia. So, I've dubbed it Tuscany on the Adriatic. As I said, it reminded me a lot of Tuscany. So this photo is of a small town in central Istria, and I picked this picture mostly because of the yellow street sign. So I mentioned that Istria had a lot of Italians and Croatians, if you remember. So it had gone back and forth over this time in different, it was Italian for a while, it was independent for a while, now it's part of Croatia. But road signs in Istria are all in both Croatian and Italian. So the name of this town on the yellow sign in Croatian is Oprijaj. I don't know how to pronounce that word. It's something like that. But Oprijaj. In Italian, it's Portola. And that was one of the things about languages that was really interesting to me, was that very often Croatian and Italian didn't seem similar at all. And the Italian word usually was more similar to English, so for me, Italian was easier to guess at. Croatian, it seemed like a lot of the words bore no similarity to anything that we would know. But these towns, the reason I call it, that I say it's like Tuscany, if anyone's been to or seen pictures of Tuscany, is that Istria is these beautiful rolling hills, and a lot of the hills will have a town on the top, and usually there's a steeple and a church and a few cafes and really nice people. We met so many people. We rented a car and drove around, and a couple times we didn't have a plan, but we just went up and introduced ourselves to people, and had great conversations. We stayed for a month at a town in southwest Istria, the star on the little map here, called Fajana. I do know that that's how you pronounce the Z, because I was there for a month and they taught me. Fajana was absolutely stunning. So I took that picture too. It's a fishing village right on the Adriatic, you can see. That's the church. Has about, I think, 2,500 people who live there, or maybe smaller. A few restaurants. But in the summer, it's known as the ferry point to go to these islands off the coast where Tito used to have his summer retreat. It's like his Camp David, let's say. And so in the summer, the ferry would go back and forth a lot, but in the spring, when we were there, it was kind of quiet. I put this picture up because it was a fishing village, and yes, you could just in the morning go buy whatever was caught for the day. And she was a very nice lady. She spoke Croatian, and R-I-B-A, riba, is the Croatian word for fish. She did not speak English, but the sign says fish. She spoke Italian, and the word pesce is Italian for fish. And she spoke German, F-I-S-C-H, fish. I found this out because I went to see her many days, and I would buy stuff. And I knew nur ein bisschen Deutsche, only a little German. I knew even less Italian and almost no Croatian, except what Google Translate could give me. And unfortunately, she spoke all 3 of those really well and almost no English. But we figured it out, and I don't think she took me because I always got good fish, and I never left with all my money. I always had some money left at the end, so I think it was good. I wanted to mention, just in terms of the travelogue, that we were there in April, which was just a gorgeous time to be there. The days were just sunny day after sunny day after sunny day after sunny day. It was wonderful. And we were there at Easter. And many of these countries have a very, very deep tie to either the Catholic or the Orthodox Church. And Easter was a big deal. And so the church there, they had a service, and I said it was like the the clown car at the old Syria Mosque circus, because all these people kept going in, and I thought there's no way they could all fit in this church. And then at the end of the service, I went down and was talking to somebody for a while, and they all came out, and it was like the clown car. They just kept coming and kept coming. So I don't know how they fit. But then they had a kind of a gathering with food. So there were a bunch of church women who fed people, which I think we from Pittsburgh can identify with. That's what we do. And they had this egg down here at the bottom right. This was in kind of a support for Ukraine. So in April, this was after the war had started. And it was, I don't know how to describe it, but it was different from Easter here, in that it seemed like the whole town was there, and they were just hanging out. So there was some food, but it wasn't like people ate and then left. There wasn't any place to sit. But people were there for a good 2 or 3 hours. And so I stayed, and my husband, Joe, and I met people and talked to some kids, talked to some older people. And it just seemed as though everybody was delighted to have a glorious day to be together. And it was very celebratory. I definitely had that sense from a religious perspective that their celebration of Easter was really meaningful and was a real celebration. It wasn't commercialized at all, and I'm not going to slam America. I love it here too, but Easter really seemed to be a day where everybody got together and they were celebrating the end of Lent, and they were delighted to be together doing it. And that was what it was. So it was a wonderful experience to be there for a holiday that I'm familiar with, but to experience it through a very different lens, a very different set of eyes. In Fajana, we also took a walk out one of the roads, and on the left there, that's my husband Joe, but there was a monument, and we saw these a lot, so I picked this one picture. The Red Star is a monument to someone who lost their life in the struggle against the Nazis. And there are these Red Star monuments all over the place. So during World War II, there was a very strong resistance in this part of Europe. And so that picture was just one of many, many, many such monuments we saw that described a couple of people and a little bit about what they did. And usually Joe and I would get our phones out and, like many of you, look them up on the internet and learn more about what they did. But there was a very strong sense of appreciation, even today, for what was done to try to resist the Nazis, even though the Nazis had conquered the country near the beginning of World War II. And then the other picture I had was just, again, Občina Fajana, again, two very different words, and then this whole language thing. So again, Croatian, doviđenja, English, goodbye, German, auf Wiedersehen, and Italian, arrivederci. And I'm just making a point of it because it became so natural to see different languages and just to pick up Google Translate on our phones all the time. Even though it was frustrating, I got used to it. And I'm just going to mention that when I realized that it was a little bit frustrating was when I came home. And in June, we got home, and after we were here for a couple days, I did one of the most amazing things in years, which was I walked into Giant Eagle, I got a cart full of groceries, I was back in the car, I didn't have to ask anybody a question, the whole thing was done in 30 minutes flat. And I have to say that in Croatia and in Italy and in Poland, grocery shopping for me was a big, long plan and looking up translating of this, that, and the other, and then staring at cans of things and wondering if this is low fat or extra fat. I don't know. It was awful. And most of the places that we shopped didn't seem to have good internet access, so my phone wasn't helpful. So I'm now a big fan of shopping for groceries in America because it was so wonderful. Okay, a little bit more about Istria. And again, I don't want this to be a travel log exactly, but I wanted to try to share some of the places that are different. And Pula is a city at the very tip of Istria, at the very bottom there. And that picture at the bottom left, if the first thing you thought of was the Colosseum in Rome, nope, that's not it. That's the Roman Forum, the Roman, they don't call it amphitheater. Okay, that is not the Colosseum in Rome. It is the Roman amphitheater in Pula. So the Holy Roman Empire in the BC era and the early AD era was in charge of Istria and this area, and they built aqueducts, and they built temples, and they built beautiful amphitheaters. This one happens to still be in great shape, and it looks very much like the Roman Colosseum. Here is Roman ruins that there's just an apartment building built next to them. And up at the top left, that's Roman ruins. So again, we Americans, we just can't deal, like, we don't have something to equate this to. So Roman ruins means 2,000 years old. And up there, they have a playground right next to them. So the kids are throwing their balls and kicking their balls around into the stones that the Romans put there 2,000 years ago. And the way that we saw ruins and old places in Istria and a lot of this part of Europe was a combination of these things, which is many places are preserved, like that amphitheater, and turned into tourist places or theaters, things like that. So they're preserved. Others are basically ignored and built around or built on top of. And then some others are a combination, like the one by the playground. So what they did there is they kind of walled off the section that they didn't want to be torn down or messed up, and then they built a playground next to it. And it was kind of neat, I thought. So it wasn't like everything was a tourist attraction, but also there were places that were well cared for that you could learn from. So Pula was a wonderful city. Next, I want to talk a little bit about Rijeka, I alluded to earlier. Rijeka is in Croatia. It's the third largest city in Croatia. Anybody know what either of the other two bigger cities in Croatia are? Zagreb. So Zagreb is the capital and the largest city in Croatia. Anybody know the second largest city in Croatia? Dubrovnik is fourth or fifth. But close to Dubrovnik is Split, spelled like split, S-P-L-I-T. I say that because, as I think I said 6 months ago, I couldn't have named, I think I had heard of Zagreb, but I couldn't have named any of these. So Rijeka is the third largest city in Croatia, shrug. But it also was fascinating. Couple pictures. I'm going to go a little bit quickly through this, but I wanted to highlight some of the takeaways I had from being in Rijeka. One is, like much of this part of Europe on the left, there are a lot of beautiful churches of all kinds of different architecture. And so there are Gothic, big Gothic, complicated ones, and there are very simple ones, and a lot in between. That's the inside of a cathedral, and I realized when I came back how Joe and I had visited a lot of cathedrals because they're all over the place. They're just open. So on a Tuesday afternoon, if we decide to take a walk, we could walk into any church or cathedral we wanted. They were all open. And so we did. So we have a lot of pictures of churches that we didn't label, so sometimes I had to guess where they were. This one definitely was in Rijeka. And they're beautiful. This statue is of Mother Teresa, and it's at one of the cathedrals that's up on a mountain in Rijeka. And she is very, very revered in Rijeka. She had visited there. And I just want to point out the rosaries on her hands. Again, I found a very deep connection there with the true respect for many people. And these rosaries, I was talking to a lady, people would bring them, and then the church would give them or do things with them, but they were always renewed. So people would just come and give rosaries to Mother Teresa's statue. And there was just, as I said, a strong sense of reverence that I thought was beautiful. And then also I wanted to mention, this is a castle of Tsat, T-R-S-A-T, Tsat. And it's open for tourists. The church, there's a cathedral there, so it was kind of neat. And we got inside, and up at the top left, I don't know if you can tell, but there's a bar there. Like, I'm not kidding, it's just a bar. And so I wanted to put this late in the talk because if it seemed like I'm talking about how fantastic things were and how wonderfully reverent everyone is, and Easter in Fajana was fantastic, and oh, we American, no, that's not it. I mean, we went to this beautiful, built in 700, I think, or 780, castle with a beautiful church next to it. And yep, this was at probably 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and they were setting up the bar for a big party that night. So consumerism is there too. Now, I do want to get serious for a moment, though. In Rijeka also, the left and top are photos I took of a huge obelisk in central Rijeka. When I say huge, I should have looked it up, but I'm going to guess it's more than 100 feet tall. And it's narrow. It's probably at the base, maybe 6 feet wide and on 4 sides. But there are these murals carved, I don't know what, bas-relief type murals, and there were, I believe, 8 or 12 scenes, and I took pictures I thought I'd share too. So these are basically having to do with the communist time in Croatia and Rijeka in particular. And so at the left there, the basic story, we looked this up on the internet, so I'm not making this up, but also we had to kind of figure it out by doing a little research. So on the left there is basically the man standing in front of his wife to try to protect her from the invading Soviets and from their family having everything taken from them. And at the top right is a similar type of story where the man has been imprisoned by the communists and the wife is at home with the baby having to take care of things. And during a period of Croatian history, and particularly this part of Croatia, communism was, this was particularly in the 30s and 40s, early 40s, but Stalin's communism was horrific. There are stories and stories and stories of massacres that took place. And one of the things that really became clear was that in Europe, there is a long history of human beings, just like you and I, doing horrific things to each other as they were conquering each other. And so when we read now, for example, about accusations about what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, it seems to me, as an American, to be shocking. This is the stuff I would have read about in history books. And to me, it's shocking that this could be happening now. But talking to people there, it wasn't shocking. Horrible, yes. So it's not like it's accepted, but it doesn't have that shock like they can't believe it because it's been going on forever. And we were there before the Ukraine war broke out. And I remember a guy talking, not about Ukraine, but about Crimea. And about how, oh, the Russians did this and that and the other in Crimea. And it's just, he was saying, like, that's the next version of all this. And so, so this monument there is just a reminder, I guess, that evil can happen and has happened in many of our lifetimes. And then we were back there, and I saw this graffiti. There's a lot of graffiti in Europe, by the way, or at least in Central and Eastern Europe. And I mean, I thought it was bad here, and I can appreciate the art in some graffiti. I just don't like that it's everywhere. It's worse. There's a lot more of it in Poland and in Italy and in Croatia and Slovenia. But I saw this and took a picture of it just because somebody had scrawled on the wall, Putin equals Hitler. And to me, that would be kind of a shrug. But there, it's really notable. And I asked somebody about it, and he said, oh, yeah, that's a big deal. Hitler was viewed as, like, they lived it, right? So what happened with the Nazis, it was people they knew, neighbors that their parents knew, their grandparents or their great uncle. It was like part of their family in many, many cases who were killed or experienced awful things. And so for somebody to scroll on a wall, Putin equals Hitler, if that was here, we'd say, some teenager, they knew a little history. But there, it was visceral. And we saw a lot of signs equating what was going on in Ukraine to what was going on in World War II. And I don't know how to repeat it over and over, but it just felt so much more powerful when it was talked about there from people who knew those who were killed during World War II. And so being in Rijeka and being in that part of the world, the things that happened both during Stalin's communism, not both, so things that happened during Stalin's communism, during World War II, and then during the following communist era, the Soviet Union, it really, again, I'm just going to say it made me realize how lucky I am and how lucky we are to not have to live that. We may not feel safe, we may not feel like everything's great, but a lot of folks who were there had family members who died or were taken away in their lifetime. And I just can't imagine how you could live with that and not have it feel different. So, last thing on Rijeka, and I'm about to wrap up, but I'm going to, I picked these two pictures to kind of close with because one of the things about Istria and Europe and lots of places we went was it was not easy to find your way around. Even with like Google Maps and GPSs, and to guess how long it was going to take to get places was really hard. So these two pictures have something in common, which was I was lost. Picture on the right is the more obvious one. I was in the car. Joe, my husband, was on a bike ride, and he's a real serious bicycle guy. I'm not. So I said, yes, dear, go rent your bike and tell me where to meet you. I'll take the car, I'll go have a coffee, talk to a few people, God knows where, and I'll meet you there. Which I thought was going to be fine until I got to this part of the trip, and I'm like, oh, crap. I was supposed to meet him at 2 o'clock, okay? So 14:16 there, arrival. That basically meant I was late, because 1400 is 2 o'clock, right? But also, if you look, you can see why. Because everything there is up and down hills. And so I was just going like 20 miles an hour, back and forth and back and forth. And then on the left, that's Joe. And this lady, we did not get her name, but we were in Rijeka, and we were lost. After we were at the castle on the top of the hill with the bar, we did not go to the bar because it wasn't open yet, so we can't blame that. But we wanted to walk, and to get back to our apartment, we could actually see our apartment building. It was on the other hill. But when we had gone up to the castle, we had taken a really long way. I took pictures of that obelisk, and we had just been touring. So we took like 3 or 4 hours of a walk one day, got up to this castle, and then it was in the afternoon, and we were tired, and we said, okay, now let's just get back over. So we knew we had to go down and up. We got so lost. And I mean, we started out, we could see our apartment building, and then we got to this point where we couldn't see it anymore. We roughly knew where it was, but we couldn't see any street that would get us there. And this lady was walking by, and so we stopped to talk to her. She spoke no English. She spoke Italian, though. And I learned only a little Italian, but Joe learned a lot more. And between the two of them, they figured it out. And so then Joe and I walked, and we found our way. But it was completely the opposite direction that we were going to go. And so I was so glad we stopped and talked to her. But after Joe talked with her, and he said what we were going to do, I was the wife. And I said, Joe, no, we can't go that way. That's the wrong direction. He said, I'm sure that's what she said. I'm sure. And so I was challenging his manhood, I was challenging his being on top of things, and I was challenging his mastery of Italian, all at the same time. Bad idea on a day when we were tired. So he just said, follow me. And she was right, he understood it, we got there. But the moral of that story was twofold. One is, when in a different place, don't count on getting from point A to point B anything like you normally would. And B, once again, it was so great to talk to people. Because he spent a good 15 minutes talking to her. I never found out about what, because I just wanted to get back and go to the bathroom, get something to drink, have the day be over. And I forgot to ask him until I saw this picture a couple days ago, and he didn't remember. But it was great. And when we approached people, I'll give us credit, because we were really kind of not American, and a number of people would say that. So I'd come up and, scusa, jestem Americani. That's Polish. I don't even remember my Italian, but, and I would just be a little bit self-effacing. I'd try a little bit of language, and if I messed it up, I'd just have them fix it for me. I'd say, jestem Americani, Amerikanski, I'm not sure. And we met people and had great conversations. And a number of them said, you're American, really. And actually, 3 or 4 times we got, I thought you were Canadian. Because they think the Canadians are nice and don't speak Italian, right? But I really was so glad that we were that way. And it was our personalities probably and our lack of language. But we met more people and learned more by being patient, but also by just going up to people rather than just staying together. And in Croatia, so kind of to close, in Croatia, I mentioned earlier that I thought it was a lot like Italy or Tuscany, except less expensive, and the people were really nice. And we were in Italy, and the people were very nice there also, but I would say that the people we met, by and large, in Croatia were much more interested in talking to us, because even though, as I learn now, it's the travel destination for Europeans, not very many Americans go there, or Canadians for that matter. And so a lot of times people would want to know what we thought of Europe and what we thought of the world, and that was kind of fun. Whereas I think in Italy there are so many American tourists that they're maybe a little more jaded and not as interested in meeting us. So, then Croatia, an hour ago, some of you had heard of, some of you knew a bit about. Now you know Zagreb, Split, and Rijeka are the top 3 cities by population in Croatia. A little more about me, and you now know that when you see this beautiful lady around the hallways, you can say, hey, Big Sal. So does anybody have any comments or questions? Yeah, Pam.
I have 2 questions. First of all, when your husband was working with the choirs, did the students have a lot of English, or did he have a translator?
Okay, so when Joe was working with the choirs, both last fall in Poland and this spring in Trieste, the students understood English somewhat. There were some, and he's been asked this, so I can answer for him. There were some students who understood and spoke really good English. And there were some students who understood some English, couldn't speak much at all, but he did not have a translator. So a lot of times he said that if he would say something and he would get going fast, one of the students who spoke good English would ask him to slow down, and they would then sort of translate.
How did you find your different apartments?
Oh, so we found them almost all of them on Airbnb because, but I'm not a commercial for Airbnb. It's simply that once I got used to it, it was just easy, and we always found some good choices. And Airbnb handles the payments, and so we didn't have to worry about getting scammed, and we were a little leery. We stayed, but I'll answer one more thing, that not that you asked it, but so I mentioned about Schengen and the whole 90-day visa and all that. Well, we had planned to get one apartment in Trieste for the whole time. Well, because we weren't going to be there the whole time, that didn't make sense. And so we ended up staying in 22 different apartments between February 16th and June 16th. I have the spreadsheet to prove it, yeah. But I think they were all on Airbnb, yeah. Yeah, oh, packing and unpacking, yes. And actually the big joke we had was we were good with clothes and the computers and all that. Like, we had that down to a science. But we had this green cloth bag from a grocery store called Despar. So it's one of those reusable shopping bags, but it was really big, and it was green. And we hated the green bag because that was the kitchen stuff. And if you're only staying for 3 or 4 days, and we didn't eat out a lot, if you're only staying for 3 or 4 days, you have to get, milk and a few fruits and this and that. So moving from place to place, the part we hated the most was who was going to carry the green bag, because it was the milk and the what, yeah. So any other comments or questions?